They laughed before she even reached the table. The sound hit the glass walls of the boardroom like champagne popping at a celebration that hadn't started yet. Ava Brooks stopped at the doorway for half a second, her hand still resting on the cold brass handle, her eyes moving across the 20-foot conference table polished so clean it reflected the ceiling lights like water. 12 executives looked at her. Some with amusement. Some with confusion. One with open contempt. Richard Whitmore leaned back in his leather chair, adjusting the silver cufflinks on his wrists like he owned the room already. His grin spread slow and sharp. "Interview floors downstairs," he said, his voice light enough to make the others laugh harder. Ava didn't answer. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, steady and deliberate, each step cutting through the laughter like a metronome. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glowed under a gray morning sky, rain tapping lightly against the glass 32 stories above the street. The city looked small from up here. Controlled. Ordered. Ava knew what it felt like to look up at buildings like this and wonder who got to belong inside them. 10 years ago, she had stood on a sidewalk 2 blocks away, staring at this exact tower while clutching a resume in one hand and a bus pass in the other, wearing shoes with worn-out soles and pretending she wasn't cold in the October wind. Back then, no one opened doors for her. Back then, no one remembered her name. And judging by the way Richard and the others looked at her now, they still didn't. Richard glanced at Daniel Pierce, the CFO seated beside him, and smirked. "Security's getting sloppy," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. Daniel gave a nervous laugh, though his eyes stayed on Ava, studying her. Ava wore a charcoal gray suit. Clean lines. No designer labels. No flashy jewelry. Just sharp edges and purpose. To Richard it wasn't enough. Not for this room. Not for this floor. In his mind, power had a look. And Ava Brooks didn't fit it. Monica Hayes from HR shifted in her chair, her pen frozen above her notepad. She looked uncomfortable, like she sensed something was off but couldn't place it yet. Ava kept walking, saying nothing, carrying only a slim black leather folder against her side. Richard watched her approach the head of the table and laughed once under his breath. "Ma'am," he said louder now, straightening in his chair. "That seat's reserved." Ava stopped beside the chair at the far end of the table, the one no one else touched, the one with the city skyline directly behind it like a throne framed in steel and rain. Her fingers brushed the backrest. Calm. Controlled. Richard stood up now, 6'2", expensive navy suit, confidence pouring off him like cologne. He had spent the last 6 months preparing for this morning. The board vote. The announcement. The press release already drafted. Everyone in this room assumed the same thing. Richard Whitmore would be the next CEO of Whitmore Global Holdings, just like his father before him. He smiled at Ava like she was a problem that could be solved with a single phone call. "You're in the wrong room," he said. Ava finally looked at him. Her expression didn't change. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Just stillness. The kind that made noise feel foolish. She set her leather folder on the polished table. The soft sound echoed louder than it should have. Around the room, the laughter faded, replaced by restless shifting, curious glances, the low hum of air conditioning. Ava looked at the empty chair. Then back at Richard. Her voice, when it came, was calm enough to freeze the room. "No," she said. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Richard Whitmore blinked once, like he had misheard her, then let out a short laugh that bounced across the polished walls of the boardroom. It was not the kind of laugh that came from humor. It came from certainty, the kind built over 20 years of corner offices, private elevators, and people stepping aside when he walked by. Around the table, the others exchanged glances, some amused, some uncomfortable, but no one spoke. Ava Brooks stood still, one hand resting on the leather folder in front of her, her posture straight, shoulders square, breathing even. She had spent years preparing for rooms like this, rooms where silence could weigh more than words. 8 years earlier, Ava had entered this same building through the side employee entrance, carrying coffee trays and filing papers as an intern in the Strategic Operations Department. She was 24 then, fresh out of Howard University, top of her class, carrying student loans and the quiet determination of someone who had no safety net waiting for her. Her mother cleaned hotel rooms in Queens. Her father had driven city buses until his heart gave out on a winter route in Brooklyn. Ava knew what hard work looked like before she knew what success looked like. Back then, she stayed late every night, studying market reports long after the office lights dimmed, running numbers nobody asked her to run, writing strategies nobody expected her to understand. But in those days, she was invisible. Just another young black woman in corporate America, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate. She remembered the first strategy proposal she ever wrote in this building, 62 pages of risk analysis and expansion forecasting. She had handed it to her supervisor, hoping for feedback, hoping to be seen. Instead, it disappeared into the machinery of the company, her name stripped from the cover before it ever reached the executive floor. Someone else had presented it. Someone else had gotten promoted. Ava learned something that day. In rooms like this, brilliance was not always enough. Sometimes you had to survive long enough for truth to catch up. So she left. Quietly. No speeches. No bitterness. Just work. She moved to Chicago, joined a struggling logistics firm, turned their losses into profit in 18 months, then helped restructure 2 Fortune 500 companies before 40. Each boardroom taught her the same lesson: people trusted power when it looked familiar. And power rarely looked like her. Richard folded his arms now, staring at her like she was a misplaced employee. "Who sent you?" he asked, his voice sharper now. Ava looked at him, calm as rain against the glass. She could still remember seeing his face years ago in company newsletters, smiling beside executives, taking credit for plans she had helped build. He had risen fast. Too fast. Daniel Pierce shifted in his chair, loosening his tie. Monica Hayes glanced down at the leather folder, then back at Ava, as if trying to place her. There was something about her face. Something familiar buried under time. Outside, thunder rolled low over the city, the storm pressing closer against the windows. Ava looked around the room slowly, recognizing the walls, the long table, the skyline beyond it. But the room felt smaller now than it once had. Smaller because she had outgrown the fear it used to carry. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This meeting is for senior leadership only." Ava's eyes did not leave his. "That is why I am here," she said. And for the first time since she walked in, Daniel Pierce stopped fidgeting. Because something in her voice did not sound like hope. It sounded like fact. Richard Whitmore hated uncertainty. It was the one thing money could not soften and power could not silence. And standing 3 feet from Ava Brooks, he felt it for the first time that morning, like a draft slipping through sealed glass. He straightened his jacket and forced a smile, the kind polished over decades of board meetings and investor dinners. Around him, the executives waited for his lead, because that was how it had always worked. Richard had been the natural successor from the moment his father stepped down as chairman 5 years earlier. Everyone knew it. Or at least everyone believed it. For 6 months, Richard had been preparing for this exact morning. The company had been unstable since the former chief executive officer retired unexpectedly after a health scare. Stockholders wanted certainty. The board wanted leadership. Richard wanted the title. He had spent weeks meeting with investors in Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco, shaking hands, promising aggressive growth, selling them on his vision for Whitmore Global Holdings. His office downstairs was already half-packed for the executive suite upstairs. Even his wife had ordered a custom crystal paperweight engraved with Chief Executive Officer Richard Whitmore. It was sitting in a box on his desk waiting for the announcement. This was supposed to be his day. He looked at Daniel Pierce, expecting support. Daniel adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Maybe there has been some confusion," Daniel said carefully, trying to soften the tension spreading through the room. Richard nodded quickly, grabbing onto the lifeline. "Exactly," he said. Human Resources made a scheduling mistake. It happens. Monica Hayes frowned at that. She knew her department did not make mistakes like that. Not on executive board day. Ava remained motionless, her hands still resting on the leather folder. Richard noticed how calm she was, and it irritated him. Most people shrank under pressure in this room. Ava looked like she had been built for it. He turned toward the others, reclaiming the room with practiced ease. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard said, opening his arms slightly, "we all know why we are here. The board vote is scheduled for 9 sharp, and we have investors waiting for the press conference at 10:30. Let us not waste time." His voice carried confidence, but under it was something else now. Urgency. A need to re-establish control. Through the rain-streaked glass, lightning flashed over the Hudson River, bright and quick, gone in an instant. The room glowed white for half a second. Monica looked at Ava again, studying her face. There was something sharp in her memory now, something from years ago. A name buried in archived reports. Ava Brooks. Strategic Operations Intern. She remembered seeing that name once on an internal draft connected to a market recovery plan. A plan that had quietly saved the company after the shipping crisis 8 years ago. But the credit had gone elsewhere. Monica's fingers tightened around her pen. Richard moved toward the head chair, placing his hand firmly on the black leather backrest. Possession. Territory. Habit. He glanced at Ava and lowered his voice. "Listen carefully," he said. "Whatever this is, you are embarrassing yourself." Ava looked at his hand on the chair, then at him. Her face stayed unreadable. "Interesting," she said quietly. Richard narrowed his eyes. "What is?" Ava tilted her head slightly, her voice calm enough to sharpen the silence. "How easy it is for people to mistake confidence for ownership." Daniel looked down. Monica stopped writing. Across the room, one of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Richard felt the words land harder than they should have. Before he could answer, the conference room doors opened behind him. Every head turned. And suddenly, the room stopped belonging to Richard Whitmore. The conference room doors opened with a soft hydraulic hiss, but the sound cut through the room sharper than thunder. Harold Bennett stepped inside, chairman of Whitmore Global Holdings, 72 years old, silver-haired, posture straight as steel despite the years. He carried no notes, no assistants, no ceremony. Just presence. And presence, Ava remembered, was the purest form of power. The room shifted immediately. Chairs straightened. Backs stiffened. Richard stepped away from the head chair, smoothing his tie, forcing confidence back into his face. "Mr. Bennett," Richard said, smiling. "Perfect timing. We were just about to begin." Harold did not answer right away. His sharp blue eyes moved across the room, landing briefly on Ava. Then the slightest nod. Not warm. Not casual. Recognition. Richard caught it and felt something tighten in his chest. Harold walked slowly toward the table, his polished shoes making soft sounds against the hardwood. "I can see that," he said at last, his voice low but carrying. Richard quickly moved to his side, eager to regain momentum. There was a small interruption. Richard said, "Nothing serious. We are ready for the vote." Harold stopped at the center of the room. "Are we?" he asked. Richard hesitated. Across the table, Monica Hayes felt her pulse rise. Daniel Pierce leaned forward slightly, watching Harold's face. Ava stayed exactly where she was, still beside the head chair, one hand resting on the leather folder like it belonged there. Harold looked at Richard. "Before we begin," he said, "there is something this board needs to review." Richard relaxed. Good, he thought. Formalities. Procedure. The usual road before the crown. Harold gestured toward Ava. "Miss Brooks brought it." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Richard's face tightened. "Miss Brooks?" he repeated. Harold nodded once. "Yes." Richard looked at Ava, then back at Harold, confused now. "I do not understand." Ava opened the leather folder with slow precision and slid a thick file onto the table. The sound of paper against polished wood felt louder than it should have. She pushed it forward. Richard frowned. "What is this?" Ava looked at him. "A strategy proposal dated 8 years ago." Monica's breath caught. Daniel looked down at the cover page. Strategic Recovery Initiative. Whitmore Global Holdings. The exact title from the crisis year. Richard's face changed for half a second. Almost too quick to catch. But Ava saw it. Harold folded his hands behind his back. "Do you remember it?" he asked Richard. Richard swallowed. "Of course. It helped stabilize the shipping division after the port closures." Ava nodded once. "It did." Richard looked annoyed now. "Why are we discussing old files?" Ava's eyes stayed on him. "Because some truths take time to reach the right room." Monica opened the file in front of her. Her eyes moved quickly across the pages. Then stopped at the original author line, restored in the archived copy. Ava Brooks. Monica looked up sharply. Daniel leaned over, seeing it too. Richard saw their expressions and his jaw tightened. The rain outside grew heavier, streaking the glass like silver wires. Harold spoke again. "This document saved the company 8 years ago. Reduced losses by $42 million in the first quarter after implementation." Richard forced a laugh, thin and hollow. "That is impressive, but I still do not see the relevance." Ava stepped forward, closer to the table now. Her voice was calm, but every word carried weight. "The relevance?" she said. "Is that the company you were preparing to lead was once saved by someone you never even bothered to remember?" And for the first time that morning, Richard Whitmore had no immediate answer. The silence that followed Ava's words felt heavier than the storm outside. Rain rolled down the 32-story windows in long silver lines, blurring the skyline into streaks of gray and white. Around the boardroom table, executives stared at the file in front of them as if it had suddenly changed shape. Monica Hayes flipped through the pages carefully, her eyes scanning dates, signatures, projections, and handwritten notes preserved in the archive. Every page pointed back to the same truth. Ava Brooks had written the recovery plan that kept Whitmore Global Holdings alive during its worst financial collapse. Daniel Pierce leaned closer, his glasses slipping down his nose. "This cannot be right," he said quietly, but not because he doubted the document. Because he understood exactly what it meant. Richard Whitmore stood frozen beside the head chair, his hand tightening against the leather until his knuckles turned pale. He remembered the file. He remembered the late nights. The emergency meetings. The panic in the hallways when the shipping division nearly collapsed under debt and legal pressure. He also remembered walking into his father's office and presenting that exact strategy as his own after it landed on his desk through middle management. At the time, he had told himself it was survival. That credit belonged to whoever could carry it. That was how business worked. But hearing Ava say it aloud, in front of the board, stripped that lie clean. Richard forced a smile, but it looked brittle now. "This is absurd," he said. "Interns do not save multinational corporations." Ava looked at him, her expression calm, almost tired. "No," she said. "People do." Harold Bennett stepped toward the table and placed both hands against the polished wood. "I verified every page myself," he said. "Original timestamps. Original authorship. Archived system logs." Richard's mouth opened, but no words came. Monica closed the file slowly and looked at Richard with a different kind of expression now. Not admiration. Not loyalty. Doubt. Ava could see it spreading across the room like a shift in weather. The room that laughed at her 10 minutes ago was no longer laughing. Richard straightened himself, gathering what remained of his authority. "Even if she wrote that report," he said sharply, "it does not change today. This board is voting on leadership, not history." Ava nodded once. "Leadership without history is just performance." The words landed hard. Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared at the rain outside, piecing things together. He had worked beside Richard for 15 years. He knew ambition. He respected it. But theft disguised as ambition was something else. Harold looked around the table. Before any vote happens, he said, there is another matter. Richard turned to him, irritation breaking through his polished image. What matter? Harold's eyes moved toward Ava. Miss Brooks has spent the last 8 years rebuilding companies larger than this one. She increased operational profit by 30% at Nolan Freight Systems, restructured Easton Logistics during their bankruptcy recovery. And last year, she turned around Harper International after their stock dropped 40%. Each company name hit the room like another weight added to the scale. Monica looked at Ava differently now. Daniel did too. Not as an outsider. As someone who had been operating far above them for years. Richard laughed once, but there was no confidence left in it. And what is the point of all this? He asked. Ava stepped closer to the head chair, her reflection sharp against the rain-dark glass behind it. Her fingers touched the chair back again, steady, familiar now. The point, she said, her voice low and clear, is that while you were preparing to inherit this company, I was learning how to lead it. And this time, no one in the room looked away. The room went still in a way Ava remembered from years ago, the kind of stillness that only happened when truth entered before anyone was ready for it. Outside the boardroom windows, the rain softened, turning from hard streaks into slow drops sliding down the glass like the city itself was catching its breath. The skyline beyond looked blurred now, softened by weather and distance, but inside the room every detail felt sharper. The polished wood table. The cold silver pitchers of water untouched. The faint hum of the air vents above. Richard Whitmore stepped back from the head chair, but only half a step, as if his body still believed it belonged there even if the room no longer agreed. Ava watched him carefully. She knew that look. The moment pride met reality, and neither knew how to move first. Harold Bennett remained standing at the center of the room, his hands folded behind his back, watching the board absorb what had just happened. Monica Hayes stared at Ava's old recovery file, her fingers resting against the paper like it might disappear as she looked away. Daniel Pierce loosened his tie again, but this time not from nerves. From pressure. The kind that comes when loyalties start shifting. Ava looked at the long conference table, at the faces that once would have dismissed her before she finished speaking. She remembered being 24, sitting alone in a rented studio apartment in Brooklyn, working under a single yellow kitchen light past midnight, building that recovery plan line by line while the city outside her window never slept. She remembered the cheap coffee turning cold beside her laptop. The radiator clicking against the winter cold. The silence. Back then, she had believed hard work spoke for itself. Life had taught her otherwise. Hard work whispered. Power amplified. That was the lesson. Not bitterness. Clarity. Richard broke the silence first. You are making this personal, he said, his voice lower now, less certain than before. Ava looked at him. No, she said softly. It became personal when my work became your ladder. The words settled over the room like dust after impact. Richard looked down for the first time all morning, his polished shoes reflecting in the dark wood floor beneath him. Harold moved toward the window, watching the storm ease over Manhattan. Leadership is not inherited, Harold said quietly, almost to himself. It is earned in silence, long before anyone is watching. Ava felt those words more than heard them. Because silence had been her territory for years. Quiet rooms. Quiet work. Quiet victories nobody applauded. Monica finally looked up. Why did you never say anything? She asked, her voice almost careful. Ava met her eyes. Because proving I was right was never as important as becoming undeniable. That answer changed something in the room. Daniel exhaled slowly, nodding to himself. He understood now. This was not revenge. This was arrival. The rain outside stopped completely, leaving thin lines of water clinging to the glass. Sunlight pushed through the clouds in narrow beams, hitting the boardroom floor in pale gold strips. The light stretched toward the head chair like an invitation. Richard noticed it too. For the first time all morning, he looked small against the room he thought he controlled. Ava placed both hands lightly on the back of the chair and looked around the table. Not with anger. Not with triumph. Just with presence. The kind of presence that no title could create, and no laughter could erase. And in the quiet that followed, every person in that room understood something they had missed the moment she walked in. Ava Brooks had not come there to ask for a seat at the table. She had come because the seat was already hers. Harold Bennett turned from the window and walked back toward the table, slow and deliberate, like every step carried the weight of a decision that had already been made. The sunlight now broke through the clouds fully, stretching across the boardroom floor and climbing the polished edge of the conference table. The storm had passed. Inside the room, another kind of storm was just reaching its center. Richard Whitmore stood motionless beside the chair he had spent months imagining as his own. His mouth was set tight, his shoulders rigid, but the confidence that once filled the room around him had thinned into something brittle. Across the table, the board members sat straighter now, their eyes shifting between Ava and Harold, waiting. Harold placed a thin white envelope on the table in front of Ava. Heavy paper. Official seal. The kind of envelope that changed careers, sometimes lives. Richard stared at it. "What is that?" he asked, though part of him already knew. Harold looked at him, calm and unshaken. "The future of this company." Ava did not touch the envelope yet. Her hands remained still, her eyes on Harold. Years of boardrooms had taught her one thing: the loudest moment in power was often the quietest. Harold looked around the room. 3 months ago, he said, the board began a national search for our next chief executive officer. Daniel frowned. Richard's face tightened. He had not known there was a real search. He had assumed it was ceremony. A formality. Harold continued. We reviewed 37 candidates. Former chief executive officers, division presidents, international consultants. He paused. Only one candidate had already proven she could save this company before she ever held a title. Monica's breath caught. Daniel looked at Ava with growing realization. Richard laughed once, sharp and short. This is politics, he said. A stunt. Harold's eyes sharpened. No, Richard. This is accountability. The word hung in the air. Heavy. Final. Ava finally placed her fingertips on the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside was a formal appointment letter. Chairman approved. Board approved. Effective immediately. Chief Executive Officer. Whitmore Global Holdings. The room seemed to contract around that moment, like the walls themselves leaned in to witness it. Richard stepped back as if the paper itself had pushed him. No, he said quietly. No, this is impossible. Harold's voice stayed even. It is already done. Ava looked down at the signature line. Harold Bennett. Board seal. Legal authority. 8 years of work. 8 years of being unseen. 8 years of building herself in rooms where no one knew her name. All of it had led here. Monica slowly stood first. Not out of obligation. Out of respect. Daniel followed. Then one by one, the board rose from their seats until only Richard remained standing apart, still frozen beside the chair he no longer had any claim to. Ava looked at him. Not with victory. Not with bitterness. Just truth. Richard's eyes dropped to the old strategy files still open on the table. His borrowed success. Her forgotten work. He saw it now, painfully clear. The ladder he climbed had been built by hands he never respected enough to notice. Harold stepped aside and gestured toward the chair at the head of the table. Miss Brooks, he said, his voice carrying through the room. Your company is waiting. Ava lifted her eyes, looked at the chair, then at the people standing before her. The same room that laughed when she walked in was standing now. Not because she demanded it. Because truth had changed the shape of power. And as Ava Brooks stepped forward to take her place, Richard Whitmore understood the hardest truth of all. Some people do not rise because they are chosen. They rise because they were built for it long before anyone believed it. Ava lowered herself into the chair at the head of the table with the same calm precision she had carried into the room, and for a moment no one moved. The leather settled beneath her, soft and firm, the weight of the position finally becoming real not through the title, but through the silence around it. The sunlight now stretched across the table in warm gold lines, catching the edge of the appointment letter and the silver pens beside it. 8 years ago, Ava had stood in this building carrying coffee. Now she sat at the head of it. But there was no smile on her face. No celebration. Only stillness. Harold Bennett took his seat to her right, folding his hands in front of him. The board slowly sat down again, the sound of chairs moving against the hardwood floor soft but deliberate. Everyone except Richard. He remained standing at the far side of the table, staring at Ava as if trying to understand how the morning had slipped so far from the future he had rehearsed. His tie hung slightly loose now. His polished certainty gone. Daniel Pierce cleared his throat and adjusted the stack of reports in front of him, but he did not look at Richard. Monica Hayes closed the old strategy file and slid it toward Ava with careful respect. Ava rested her hand on it, feeling the weight of years inside paper and ink. Richard finally spoke, his voice lower than before. "You planned this?" Ava looked up at him. "No," she said evenly. "I prepared for it." That difference hit harder than accusation. Richard swallowed and glanced at Harold. "So what now?" he asked. Harold leaned back in his chair. "That depends on Ava." The room shifted again. The power of decision now sat with her. Richard looked at Ava, and for the first time all morning, there was no mockery left in his eyes. Only uncertainty. Ava could feel the room waiting. Waiting to see if she would expose everything. The stolen report. The years of silence. The credit. Richard took and built his career on. She could. The proof was sitting inches from her hand. One sentence from her could dismantle his reputation in front of the entire board. But Ava had not spent 8 years building herself just to become smaller through revenge. She opened the strategy file one last time and looked at her younger self in the words. The long nights. The hunger. The work. It had all shaped her. Even the betrayal. She closed it and slid it back across the table toward Richard. His eyes dropped to it. Confused. Ava's voice stayed calm. "You already know what happened," she said. "I do not need the room to know for it to be true." Richard looked at her, stunned by the mercy in that sentence. Harold watched closely, saying nothing. Monica lowered her eyes. Daniel exhaled through his nose, almost in disbelief. Ava leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the table. "This company does not need humiliation," she said. "It needs honesty. Discipline. Vision." Her eyes stayed on Richard. "You made choices. Some of them wrong. But today is not about punishment." Richard's face tightened, his pride wrestling with gratitude and shame at the same time. "Why?" he asked quietly. Ava answered without hesitation. "Because leadership is not proving you can destroy someone. It is proving you do not have to." The words settled into the room deeper than any announcement had. Richard looked down at the strategy file in his hands, the file he once treated like opportunity, now feeling more like evidence of who he used to be. For the first time in years, he looked at Ava without title, without race, without hierarchy. Just truth. And in that truth, he saw the one thing he had never understood before. Strength did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walked in quietly, endured being laughed at, and still chose grace when power finally belonged to it. The board meeting ended without applause. No one felt the need for it. Some moments were too heavy for noise. The executives gathered their folders slowly, their movements quieter than when they arrived, as if the room itself had changed their weight. Harold Bennett gave Ava one final nod before stepping out, the kind of nod that said more than congratulations ever could. Daniel Pierce paused at the door and looked back at her. "Welcome home," he said softly before leaving. Monica Hayes lingered a moment longer, placing her hand over the old strategy file still resting in Richard's hands. "I remember your name now," she said to Ava, and there was something close to regret in her voice before she followed the others out. Then the room emptied. Just Ava and Richard remained. The city outside had transformed. The storm was gone. Sunlight poured across Manhattan, bright against the glass towers, reflecting in sharp flashes like the city had been polished clean. Ava sat alone at the head of the table, her fingertips resting lightly against the smooth wood, feeling the silence settle around her like something earned. Richard stood near the far end, holding the old file against his chest, staring at the pages that had once been invisible to him. For the first time in his career, there was no title between them. No audience. No performance. Just truth in a quiet room. Richard walked toward the table slowly, his shoes softer now against the floor, as if certainty had left his step. He stopped across from her and placed the file down carefully. "I should have known," he said, his voice rough with honesty. Ava looked at him. "Known what?" Richard glanced at the pages, then back at her. "That talent does not need permission to exist." The words hung there. Simple. Late. Real. Ava leaned back in the chair and looked toward the skyline. She thought about her mother making beds in hotel rooms 12 hours a day so Ava could stay in school. She thought about her father gripping a city bus steering wheel through snowstorms to keep food on the table. She thought about the nights she worked until 2 in the morning, building plans no one would credit. All those invisible miles. All those unseen miles. And now here she was. Not because the world had become fair, but because she had kept walking anyway. Richard exhaled slowly. "What happens to me?" he asked. It was not a question about employment. It was bigger than that. Ava looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood. The chair behind her turned slightly, soft leather shifting in the sunlight. "That depends on what you do next," she said. Richard nodded once. No defense. No excuses. Just understanding. He picked up the file and turned toward the door, stopping once before leaving. "I laughed when you walked in," he said quietly. Ava met his eyes. "I know." Richard lowered his gaze, then left the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the boardroom fell completely silent. Ava walked to the window and stood there, 32 floors above the city, looking down at the streets where people moved like rivers between buildings, each carrying battles no one else could see. The sunlight warmed the glass beneath her fingertips. Behind her, the polished nameplate on the table caught the light. Ava Brooks, Chief Executive Officer. She looked at it only once, then looked back at the city. Because the title was never the victory. The journey was. The proof was. The truth was. Somewhere below, traffic moved. Somewhere above, clouds broke apart into blue sky. And in the stillness of that room, where laughter had once filled the air, there was only silence now. Not the silence of doubt. The silence of justice.